when we talk about decision rights define who has the authority and accountability for certain decisions within an organization. So, and we really need to have both there, because if you have authority but no accountability, you essentially can create tyrants. And if you have no authority and all accountability, you're essentially a scapegoat, right? So we want to make sure that teams and individuals with decision rights have both these elements. But if we rely on decision rights in which we have to defer all the decision rights up the hierarchy for senior executives to make decisions, then make those decisions and revolve down back to the organization, that will take a long time. So that's why teams need to have these decision rights, and the decision rights guardrails make sure that teams get this autonomy to make decisions while at the same time being aligned with other teams within the organization. There's 4 kinds of guardrails that come up again and again in my research. One is around purpose. We call it purpose in action. And this is really around purpose is what guides and drives organizations where you want to move to. So if you have teams making their own decisions, you really hope that the purpose is what drives them and informs their decision making, right? So to give an example, one of the icons of my home country of the Netherlands is Philips. It used to be a huge conglomerate selling tons of things. Now they're a health technology company. And their purpose is to improve health and sustainability through innovation. And that is very broad as a purpose. So in order to make sure that that becomes a purpose in action, what you see is that they rely on certain practices, lean practices like Hoshinkanri. Another really important guardrail that we've identified is democracy of data, because we've seen that data ownership can really restrict decision making. There used to be these lots of silos of data, and we don't want that. Ideally, we want to make sure that teams have access to and an understanding of all the data that they need to make evidence-based decisions. So by that, I don't mean, open up the data, make it available for everyone in the organization, but we want to make sure that teams can have rapid access and regulated access to the data they need in their daily practice. So that could mean, for instance, at an abstracted level, making sure that everything is still compliant. And we can really see in organizations that we study that, for instance, data centers of excellence are really important there, making sure that the data platforms are in place, that there are norms of acceptable data use, data provisioning, all of that really important there to make sure that when teams make decisions, they have that understanding, that greater understanding beyond their own context. The third guardrail deals with policy. We call it minimum viable policy, MVP, and not like minimum viable products where you start small and make it bigger. It's quite the opposite. It's about removing a lot of the rules, regulations, standards that large established organizations have accumulated over time, and really make it simpler to make sure that teams do not get stuck in red tape and committees that have to make decisions. I spoke this morning to someone who said that they were waiting for 6 months for a committee to make a decision. If you're trying to move fast as a team, that won't work. So we're looking into, okay, what are some of these practices? How do you get to figure out what is minimum viable? And the last guardrail has to do with resources. We call it resources to run, because so often we hear about teams that have a great idea. They've identified a problem for a customer or a need that they want to address, and they've gotten the data, looked at it from every angle, made a decision, and now they want to execute. They want to move forwards, but they don't have the physical, financial, or resources, or quite often the talent to make that next step. So it's really about how do you make sure that teams can keep going. And what we often see in large established organizations is that is hard because the resource allocation mechanisms that we've tended to use over all the years are slow, typically project-based, on a yearly basis. And you can see that if you just spend 4 months making a plan for the next calendar year, and June comes around and a team says, oh my God, we have this great opportunity. We really need to capitalize on this. And you hear, well, I'm sorry, because you have to wait until the next year. That doesn't really fly. So companies are now exploring, we see this in our research, ways in which they can accelerate that, in which they can release resources much quicker, much more often. We hear about things like releasing creating contingent resources that teams can tap into if certain scenarios occur or conditions materialize. They can do that. So yeah, those are the 4 guardrails. Really being guided by purpose, having the data broadly within the organization to make better decisions, policies that help you make decisions, right? If you have a good policy, that's what a policy is, decisions that are made for you that can help to accelerate decision making, and then the resources to really execute on all of that. That's what we found.